Passing by Nella Larsen. 3 centuries removed from the scenes his fathers loved, spicy grove, cinnamon tree, what is Africa to me? County Cullen. Part 1. Encounter. Part 1. Section 1. It was the last letter in Irene Redfield's little pile of morning mail. After her other ordinary and clearly directed letters, the long envelope of thin Italian paper with its almost illegible scrawl seemed out of place and alien, and there was, too, something mysterious and slightly furtive about it. A thin, sly thing which bore no return address to betray the sender. Not that she hadn't immediately known who its sender was. Some 2 years ago, she had one very like it in outward appearance. Furtive, but yet in some peculiar determined way a little flaunting. Purple ink, foreign paper of extraordinary size. It had been, Irene noted, postmarked in New York the day before. Her brows came together in a tiny frown. The frown, however, was more from perplexity than from annoyance, though there was in her thoughts an element of both. She was wholly unable to comprehend such an attitude towards danger as she was sure the letter's contents would reveal, and she disliked the idea of opening and reading it. This, she reflected, was of a piece with all that she knew of Claire Kendry, stepping always on the edge of danger, always aware, but not drawing back or turning aside, certainly not because of any alarms or feeling of outrage on the part of others. And for a swift moment, Irene Redfield seemed to see a pale, small girl sitting on a ragged blue sofa, sewing pieces of bright red cloth together, while her drunken father, a tall, powerfully built man, raged threateningly up and down the shabby room, bellowing curses and making spasmodic lunges at her, which were not the less frightening because they were, for the most part, ineffectual. Sometimes he did manage to reach her, but only the fact that the child had edged herself and her poor sewing over to the farthermost corner of the sofa suggested that she was in any way perturbed by this menace to herself and her work. Claire had known well enough that it was unsafe to take a portion of the dollar that was her weekly wage for the doing of many errands for the dressmaker who lived on the top floor of the building of which Bob Kendry was janitor. But that knowledge had not deterred her. She wanted to go to her Sunday school's picnic, and she had made up her mind to wear a new dress. So, in spite of certain unpleasantness and possible danger, she had taken the money to buy the material for that pathetic little red frock. There had been, even in those days, nothing sacrificial in Claire Kendry's idea of life, no allegiance beyond her own immediate desire. She was selfish and cold and hard, and yet she had, too, a strange capacity of transforming warmth and passion, verging sometimes almost on theatrical heroics. Irene, who was a year or more older than Claire, remembered the day that Bob Kendry had been brought home dead, killed in a silly saloon fight. Claire, who was at that time a scant 15 years old, had just stood there with her lips pressed together, her thin arms folded across her narrow chest, staring down at the familiar pasty white face of her parent with a sort of disdain in her slanting black eyes. For a very long time she had stood like that, silent and staring. Then, quite suddenly, she had given way to a torrent of weeping, swaying her thin body, tearing at her bright hair and stamping her small feet. The outburst had ceased as suddenly as it had begun. She glanced quickly about the bare room, taking everyone in, even the 2 policemen, in a sharp look of flashing scorn. And in the next instant, she had turned and vanished through the door. Seen across the long stretch of years, the thing had more the appearance of an outpouring of pent-up fury than of an overflow of grief for her dead father. Though she had been, Irene admitted, fond enough of him in her own rather cat-like way. Cat-like? Certainly that was the word which best described Claire Kendry, if any single word could describe her. Sometimes she was hard and apparently without feeling at all. Sometimes she was affectionate and rashly impulsive, and there was about her an amazing soft malice, hidden well away until provoked. Then she was capable of scratching, and very effectively too. Or, driven to anger, she would fight with a ferocity and impetuousness that disregarded or forgot any danger, superior strength, numbers, or other unfavorable circumstances. How savagely she had clawed those boys the day they had hooted her parent and sung a derisive rhyme of their own composing, which pointed out certain eccentricities in his careening gait, and how deliberately she had. Irene brought her thoughts back to the present, to the letter from Claire Kendry that she still held unopened in her hand. With a little feeling of apprehension, she very slowly cut the envelope, drew out the folded sheets, spread them, and began to read. It was, she saw at once, what she had expected since learning from the postmark that Claire was in the city. An extravagantly phrased wish to see her again. Well, she needn't and wouldn't, Irene told herself, accede to that. Nor would she assist Claire to realize her foolish desire to return for a moment to that life which long ago, and of her own choice, she had left behind her. She ran through the letter, puzzling out as best she could the carelessly formed words or making instinctive guesses at them. For I am lonely, so lonely. Can't help longing to be with you again, as I have never longed for anything before, and I have wanted many things in my life. You can't know how in this pale life of mine I'm all the time seeing the bright pictures of that other that I once thought I was glad to be free of. It's like an ache, a pain that never ceases. Sheets upon thin sheets of it, and ending finally with, and it's your fault, Renee dear, at least partly, for I wouldn't now perhaps have this terrible, this wild desire if I hadn't seen you that time in Chicago. Brilliant red patches flamed in Irene Redfield's warm olive cheeks. That time in Chicago. The words stood out from among the many paragraphs of other words, bringing with them a clear, sharp remembrance, in which even now, after 2 years, humiliation, resentment, and rage were mingled. Part 1, Section 2. This is what Irene Redfield remembered. Chicago, August. A brilliant day, hot, with a brutal, staring sun pouring down rays that were like molten rain. A day on which the very outlines of the buildings shuddered as if in protest at the heat. Quivering lines sprang up from baked pavements and wriggled along the shining car tracks. The automobiles parked at the curbs were a dancing blaze, and the glass of the shop windows threw out a blinding radiance. Sharp particles of dust rose from the burning sidewalks, stinging the seared or dripping skins of wilting pedestrians. What small breeze there was seemed like the breath of a flame fanned by slow bellows. It was on that day of all others that Irene set out to shop for the things which she had promised to take home from Chicago to her 2 small sons, Brian Jr. and Theodore. Characteristically, she had put it off until only a few crowded days remained of her long visit, and only this sweltering one was free of engagements till the evening. Without too much trouble, she had got the mechanical airplane for Junior, but the drawing book, for which Ted had so gravely and insistently given her precise directions, had sent her in and out of 5 shops without success. It was while she was on her way to a 6th place that right before her smarting eyes, a man toppled over and became an inert, crumpled heap on the scorching cement. About the lifeless figure, a little crowd gathered. Was the man dead or only faint? Someone asked her, but Irene didn't know and didn't try to discover. She edged her way out of the increasing crowd, feeling disagreeably damp and sticky and soiled from contact with so many sweating bodies. For a moment, she stood fanning herself and dabbing at her moist face with an inadequate scrap of handkerchief. Suddenly she was aware that the whole street had a wobbly look, and realized that she was about to faint. With a quick perception of the need for immediate safety, she lifted a wavering hand in the direction of a cab parked directly in front of her. The perspiring driver jumped out and guided her to his car. He helped, almost lifted her in. She sank down on the hot leather seat. For a minute, her thoughts were nebulous. They cleared. I guess, she told her Samaritan, it's tea I need. On a roof somewhere. The Drayton, ma'am, he suggested. They do say as how it's always a breeze up there. Thank you. I think the Drayton'll do nicely, she told him. There was that little grating sound of the clutch being slipped in as the man put the car in gear and slid deftly out into the boiling traffic. Reviving under the warm breeze stirred up by the moving cab, Irene made some small attempts to repair the damage that the heat and crowds had done to her appearance. All too soon, the rattling vehicle shot towards the sidewalk and stood still. The driver sprang out and opened the door before the hotel's decorated attendant could reach it. She got out, and thanking him smilingly, as well as in a more substantial manner for his kind helpfulness and understanding, went in through the Drayton's wide doors. Stepping out of the elevator that had brought her to the roof, she was led to a table just in front of a long window whose gently moving curtains suggested a cool breeze. It was, she thought, like being wafted upward on a magic carpet to another world, pleasant, quiet, and strangely remote from the sizzling one that she had left below. The tea, when it came, was all that she had desired and expected. In fact, so much was it what she had desired and expected that after the first deep, cooling drink, she was able to forget it, only now and then sipping, a little absently, from the tall green glass, while she surveyed the room about her, or looked out over some lower buildings, at the bright, unstirred blue of the lake, reaching away to an undetected horizon. She had been gazing down for some time at the specks of cars and people creeping about in streets, and thinking how silly they looked, when on taking up her glass she was surprised to find it empty at last. She asked for more tea, and while she waited, began to recall the happenings of the day, and to wonder what she was to do about Ted and his book. Why was it that almost invariably he wanted something that was difficult or impossible to get, like his father, forever wanting something that he couldn't have? Presently there were voices, a man's booming one and a woman's slightly husky. A waiter passed her, followed by a sweetly scented woman in a fluttering dress of green chiffon, whose mingled pattern of narcissuses, jonquils, and hyacinths was a reminder of pleasantly chill spring days. Behind her there was a man, very red in the face, who was mopping his neck and forehead with a big crumpled handkerchief. "Oh dear," Irene groaned, rasped by annoyance, for after a little discussion and commotion, they had stopped at the very next table. She had been alone there at the window, and it had been so satisfyingly quiet. Now, of course, they would chatter. But no. Only the woman sat down. The man remained standing, abstractedly pinching the knot of his bright blue tie. Across the small space that separated the two tables, his voice carried clearly. "See you later, then," he declared, looking down at the woman. There was pleasure in his tones and a smile on his face. His companion's lips parted in some answer, but her words were blurred by the little intervening distance and the medley of noises floating up from the streets below. They didn't reach Irene, but she noted the peculiar caressing smile that accompanied them. The man said, "Well, I suppose I'd better," and smiled again, and said goodbye, and left. An attractive-looking woman, was Irene's opinion, with those dark, almost black eyes and that wide mouth like a scarlet flower against the ivory of her skin. Nice clothes, too, just right for the weather, thin and cool without being mussy, as summer things were so apt to be. A waiter was taking her order. Irene saw her smile up at him as she murmured something. Thanks, maybe. It was an odd sort of smile. Irene couldn't quite define it, but she was sure that she would have classed it, coming from another woman, as being just a shade too provocative for a waiter. About this one, however, there was something that made her hesitate to name it that. A certain impression of assurance, perhaps. The waiter came back with the order. Irene watched her spread out her napkin, saw the silver spoon in the white hand, slit the dull gold of the melon. Then, conscious that she had been staring, she looked quickly away. Her mind returned to her own affairs. She had settled, definitely, the problem of the proper one of 2 frocks for the bridge party that night, in rooms whose atmosphere would be so thick and hot that every breath would be like breathing soup. The dress decided, her thoughts had gone back to the snag of Ted's book, her unseeing eyes far away on the lake, when by some 6th sense she was acutely aware that someone was watching her. Very slowly she looked around and into the dark eyes of the woman in the green frock at the next table. But she evidently failed to realize that such intense interest as she was showing might be embarrassing, and continued to stare. Her demeanor was that of one who, with utmost singleness of mind and purpose, was determined to impress firmly and accurately each detail of Irene's features upon her memory for all time, nor showed the slightest trace of disconcertment at having been detected in her steady scrutiny. Instead, it was Irene who was put out. Feeling her color heighten under the continued inspection, she slid her eyes down. What, she wondered, could be the reason for such persistent attention? Had she, in her haste in the taxi, put her hat on backwards? Guardedly, she felt at it. Number? Perhaps there was a streak of powder somewhere on her face. She made a quick pass over it with her handkerchief. Something wrong with her dress? She shot a glance over it. Perfectly all right. What was it? Again she looked up, and for a moment her brown eyes politely returned the stare of the other's black ones, which never for an instant fell or wavered. Irene made a little mental shrug. Oh well, let her look. She tried to treat the woman and her watching with indifference, but she couldn't. All her efforts to ignore her, were futile. She stole another glance, still looking. What strange, languorous eyes she had. And gradually there rose in Irene a small inner disturbance, odious and hatefully familiar. She laughed softly, but her eyes flashed. Could that woman somehow know that here, before her very eyes on the roof of the Drayton, sat a Negro? Absurd! Impossible! White people were so stupid about such things for all that they usually asserted that they were able to tell, and by the most ridiculous means, fingernails, palms of hands, shapes of ears, teeth, and other equally silly rot. They always took her for an Italian, a Spaniard, a Mexican, or a gypsy. Never when she was alone had they even remotely seemed to suspect that she was a Negro. No, the woman sitting there staring at her couldn't possibly know. Nevertheless, Irene felt, in turn, anger, scorn, and fear slide over her. It wasn't that she was ashamed of being a Negro, or even of having it declared. It was the idea of being ejected from any place, even in the polite and tactful way in which the Drayton would probably do it, that disturbed her. But she looked, boldly this time, back into the eyes still frankly intent upon her. They did not seem to her hostile or resentful. Rather, Irene had the feeling that they were ready to smile if she would. Nonsense, of course. The feeling passed, and she turned away with the firm intention of keeping her gaze on the lake, the roofs of the buildings across the way, the sky, anywhere but on that annoying woman. Almost immediately, however, her eyes were back again. In the midst of her fog of uneasiness, she had been seized by a desire to outstare the rude observer. Suppose the woman did know or suspect her race. She couldn't prove it. Suddenly her small fright increased. Her neighbor had risen and was coming towards her. What was going to happen now? "Pardon me," the woman said pleasantly, "but I think I know you." Her slightly husky voice held a dubious note. Looking up at her, Irene's suspicions and fears vanished. There was no mistaking the friendliness of that smile or resisting its charm. Instantly she surrendered to it and smiled too as she said, "I'm afraid you're mistaken." "Why, of course I know you," the other exclaimed. "Don't tell me you're not Irene Westover, or do they still call you Renee?" In the brief second before her answer, Irene tried vainly to recall where and when this woman could have known her. There, in Chicago, and before her marriage. That much was plain. High school? College? WCA committees? High school, most likely. What white girls had she known well enough to have been familiarly addressed as Renee by them? The woman before her didn't fit her memory of any of them. Who was she? Yes, I'm Irene Westover. And though nobody calls me Renee anymore, it's good to hear the name again. And you... She hesitated, ashamed that she could not remember, and hoping that the sentence would be finished for her. Don't you know me? Not really, Renee? I'm sorry, but just at the minute I can't seem to place you. Irene studied the lovely creature standing beside her for some clue to her identity. Who could she be? Where and when had they met? And through her perplexity, there came the thought that the trick which her memory had played her was for some reason more gratifying than disappointing to her old acquaintance, that she didn't mind not being recognized. And two, Irene felt that she was just about to remember her. For about the woman was some quality, an intangible something, too vague to define, too remote to seize, but which was, to Irene Redfield, very familiar. And that voice? Surely she'd heard those husky tones somewhere before, perhaps before time, contact, or something had been at them, making them into a voice remotely suggesting England. Ha! Could it have been in Europe that they had met? Renee. Perhaps, Irene began. You... The woman laughed, a lovely laugh, a small sequence of notes that was like a trill, and also like the ringing of a delicate bell fashioned of a precious metal, a tinkling. Irene drew a quick, sharp breath. Claire, she exclaimed, not really Claire Kendry? So great was her astonishment that she had started to rise. No, don't get up, Claire Kendry commanded, and sat down herself. You've simply got to stay and talk. We'll have something more. Tea? Fancy meeting you here. It's simply too lucky. It's awfully surprising, Irene told her, and seeing the change in Claire's smile, knew that she had revealed a corner of her own thoughts. But she only said, I'd never in this world have known you if you hadn't laughed. You are changed, you know, and yet in a way you're just the same. Perhaps, Claire replied. Oh, just a second. She gave her attention to the waiter at her side. Let's see. 2 teas, and bring some cigarettes. Why, yes, they'll be all right. Thanks. Again, that odd upward smile. Now, Irene was sure that it was too provocative for a waiter. While Claire had been giving the order, Irene made a rapid mental calculation. It must be, she figured, all of 12 years since she, or anybody that she knew, had laid eyes on Claire Kendry. After her father's death, she'd gone to live with some relatives, aunts or cousins 2 or 3 times removed, over on the west side, relatives that nobody had known the Kendrys possessed until they had turned up at the funeral and taken Claire away with them. For about a year or more afterwards, she would appear occasionally among her old friends and acquaintances on the south side for short little visits that were, they understood, always stolen from the endless domestic tasks in her new home. With each succeeding one, she was taller, shabbier, and more belligerently sensitive. And each time the look on her face was more resentful and brooding. I'm worried about Claire. She seems so unhappy, Irene remembered her mother saying. The visits dwindled, becoming shorter, fewer, and further apart, until at last they ceased. Irene's father, who had been fond of Bob Kendry, made a special trip over to the west side about 2 months after the last time Claire had been to see them, and returned with the bare information that he had seen the relatives and that Claire had disappeared. What else he had confided to her mother in the privacy of their own room, Irene didn't know. But she had had something more than a vague suspicion of its nature, for there had been rumors that were, to girls of 18 and 19 years, interesting and exciting. There was the one about Claire Kendry's having been seen at the dinner hour in a fashionable hotel in company with another woman and two men, all of them white and dressed, and there was another which told of her driving in Lincoln Park with a man, unmistakably white and evidently rich. Packard limousine, chauffeur in livery and all that. There had been others whose context Irene could no longer recollect, but all pointing in the same glamorous direction, and she could remember quite vividly how, when they used to repeat and discuss these tantalizing stories about Claire, the girls would always look knowingly at one another, and then, with little excited giggles, drag away their eager, shining eyes, and say with lurking undertones of regret or disbelief some such thing as, "Oh, well, maybe she's got a job or something," or, "After all, it mayn't have been Claire," or, "You can't believe all you hear." And always some girl, more matter-of-fact or more frankly malicious than the rest, would declare, "Of course it was Claire." Ruth said it was, and so did Frank, and they certainly know her when they see her as well as we do. And someone else would say, "Yes, you can bet it was Claire all right." And then they would all join in asserting that there could be no mistake about its having been Claire, and that such circumstances could mean only one thing: working indeed. People didn't take their servants to the Shelby for dinner, certainly not all dressed up like that. There would follow insincere regrets, and somebody would say, "Poor girl, I suppose it's true enough, but what can you expect? Look at her father. And her mother, they say, would have run away if she hadn't died. Besides, Claire always had a having way with her." Precisely that. The words came to Irene as she sat there on the Drayton roof, facing Claire Kendry. A having way. Well, Irene acknowledged, judging from her appearance and manner, Claire seemed certainly to have succeeded in having a few of the things that she wanted. It was, Irene repeated, after the interval of the waiter, a great surprise, and a very pleasant one to see Claire again, after all those years. 12 at least. "Why, Claire, you're the last person in the world I'd have expected to run into. I guess that's why I didn't know you," Claire answered gravely. "Yes, it is 12 years, but I'm not surprised to see you, Renee. That is, not so very. In fact, ever since I've been here, I've more or less hoped that I should, or someone. Preferably you, though. Still, I imagine that's because I've thought of you often and often, while I'll wager you've never given me a thought." It was true, of course. After the first speculations and indictments, Claire had gone completely from Irene's thoughts, and from the thoughts of others too, if their conversation was any indication of their thoughts. Besides, Claire had never been exactly one of the group, just as she'd never been merely the janitor's daughter, but the daughter of Mr. Bob Kendry, who, it was true, was a janitor, but who also, it seemed, had been in college with some of their fathers. Just how or why he happened to be a janitor, and a very inefficient one at that, they none of them quite knew. One of Irene's brothers, who had put the question to their father, had been told, "That's something that doesn't concern you," and given him the advice to be careful not to end in the same manner as poor Bob. No, Irene hadn't thought of Claire Kendry. Her own life had been too crowded. So, she supposed, had the lives of other people. She defended their forgetfulness. You know how it is. Everybody's so busy. People leave, drop out. Maybe for a little while there's talk about them or questions. Then gradually they're forgotten. "Yes, that's natural," Claire agreed. "And what," she inquired, "had they said of her for that little while at the beginning, before they'd forgotten her altogether?" Irene looked away. She felt the telltale color rising in her cheeks. "You can't," she evaded, "expect me to remember trifles like that over 12 years of marriages, births, deaths, and the war." There followed that trill of notes that was Claire Kendry's laugh, small and clear and the very essence of mockery. "Oh, Renee," she cried, "of course you remember, but I won't make you tell me, because I know just as well as if I'd been there and heard every unkind word. Oh, I know. Frank Danton saw me in the Shelby one night. Don't tell me he didn't broadcast that, and with embroidery. Others may have seen me at other times. I don't know. But once I met Margaret Hammer in Marshall Fields. I'd have spoken, was on the very point of doing it. But she cut me dead. My dear Renee, I assure you that from the way she looked through me, even I was uncertain whether I was actually there in the flesh or not. I remember it clearly, too clearly. It was that very thing which, in a way, finally decided me not to go out and see you one last time before I went away to stay. Somehow, good as all of you, the whole family, had always been to the poor, forlorn child that was me. I felt I shouldn't be able to bear that. I mean, if any of you, your mother or the boys oh, well, I just felt I'd rather not know it if you did. And so I stayed away. Silly, I suppose. Sometimes I've been sorry I didn't go. Irene wondered if it was tears that made Claire's eyes so luminous. And now, Renee, I want to hear all about you and everybody and everything. You're married, I suppose? Irene nodded. Yes, Claire said knowingly. You would be. Tell me about it. And so for an hour or more, they had sat there smoking and drinking tea and filling in the gap of 12 years with talk. That is, Irene did. She told Claire about her marriage and removal to New York, about her husband, and about her 2 sons, who were having their first experience of being separated from their parents at a summer camp, about her mother's death, about the marriages of her 2 brothers. She told of the marriages, births, and deaths in other families that Claire had known, opening up for her new vistas on the lives of old friends and acquaintances. Claire drank it all in, these things which for so long she had wanted to know and hadn't been able to learn. She sat motionless, her bright lips slightly parted, her whole face lit by the radiance of her happy eyes. Now and then she put a question, but for the most part she was silent. Somewhere outside, a clock struck. Brought back to the present, Irene looked down at her watch and exclaimed, "Oh, I must go, Claire!" A moment passed, during which she was the prey of uneasiness. It had suddenly occurred to her that she hadn't asked Claire anything about her own life, and that she had a very definite unwillingness to do so. And she was quite well aware of the reason for that reluctance. But, she asked herself, wouldn't it, all things considered, be the kindest thing not to ask? If things with Claire were as they all had suspected, wouldn't it be more tactful to seem to forget to inquire how she had spent those 12 years? If? It was that if which bothered her. It might just be, in spite of all gossip and even appearances to the contrary, that there was nothing, had been nothing, that couldn't be simply and innocently explained. Appearances, she knew now, had a way sometimes of not fitting facts, and if Claire hadn't, well, if they had all been wrong, then certainly she ought to express some interest in what had happened to her. It would seem queer and rude if she didn't. But how was she to know? There was, she at last decided, no way, so she merely said again, "I must go, Claire." "Please, not so soon, Renee," Claire begged, not moving. Irene thought, she's really almost too good-looking. It's hardly any wonder that she... And now, Renee dear, that I've found you. I mean to see lots and lots of you. We're here for a month at least. Jack, that's my husband, is here on business. Poor dear, in this heat. Isn't it beastly? Come to dinner with us tonight, won't you? And she gave Irene a curious little sidelong glance, and a sly, ironical smile peeped out on her full red lips, as if she had been in the secret of the other's thoughts, and was mocking her. Irene was conscious of a sharp intake of breath, but whether it was relief or chagrin that she felt, she herself could not have told. She said hastily, "I'm afraid I can't, Claire. I'm filled up. Dinner and bridge. I'm so sorry." Come tomorrow instead. To tea, Claire insisted. Then you'll see Marjorie. She's just 10, and Jack too, maybe, if he hasn't got an appointment or something. From Irene came an uneasy little laugh. She had an engagement for tomorrow also, and she was afraid that Claire would not believe it. Suddenly now, that possibility disturbed her. Therefore, it was with a half-vexed feeling at the sense of undeserved guilt that had come upon her that she explained that it wouldn't be possible because she wouldn't be free for tea, or for luncheon or dinner either. And the next day's Friday when I'll be going away for the weekend. Idlewild, you know. It's quite the thing now. And then she had an inspiration. Claire, she exclaimed, why don't you come up with me? Our place is probably full up. Jim's wife has a way of collecting mobs of the most impossible people, but we can always manage to find room for one more. And you'll see absolutely everybody. In the very moment of giving the invitation, she regretted it. What an idiotic impulse to have given way to. She groaned inwardly as she thought of the endless explanations in which it would involve her, of the curiosity and the talk, and the lifted eyebrows. It wasn't, she assured herself, that she was a snob, that she cared greatly for the petty restrictions and distinctions with which what called itself Negro society chose to hedge itself about, but that she had a natural and deeply rooted aversion to the kind of front-page notoriety that Claire Kendry's presence in Idlewild, as her guest, would expose her to. And here she was, perversely and against all reason, inviting her. But Claire shook her head. Really, I'd love to, Renee, she said, a little mournfully. There's nothing I like better. But I couldn't. I mustn't, you see. It wouldn't do at all. I'm sure you understand. I'm simply crazy to go, but I can't. The dark eyes glistened, and there was a suspicion of a quaver in the husky voice. And believe me, Renee, I do thank you for asking me. Don't think I've entirely forgotten just what it would mean for you if I went. That is, if you still care about such things. All indication of tears had gone from her eyes and voice, and Irene Redfield, searching her face, had an offended feeling that behind what was now only an ivory mask lurked a scornful amusement. She looked away, at the wall far beyond Claire. Well, she deserved it, for, as she acknowledged to herself, she was relieved, and for the very reason at which Claire had hinted. The fact that Claire had guessed her perturbation did not, however, in any degree lessen that relief. She was annoyed at having been detected in what might seem to be an insincerity, but that was all. The waiter came with Claire's change. Irene reminded herself that she ought immediately to go, but she didn't move. The truth was, she was curious. There were things that she wanted to ask Claire Kendry. She wished to find out about this hazardous business of passing, this breaking away from all that was familiar and friendly to take one's chance in another environment, not entirely strange perhaps, but certainly not entirely friendly. What, for example, one did about background, how one accounted for oneself, and how one felt when one came into contact with other Negroes. But she couldn't. She was unable to think of a single question that in its context or its phrasing was not too frankly curious, if not actually impertinent. As if aware of her desire and her hesitation, Claire remarked thoughtfully, You know, Renee, I've often wondered why more colored girls like you and Margaret Hammer and Esther Dawson and, oh, lots of others never passed over. It's such a frightfully easy thing to do. If one's the type, all that's needed is a little nerve. What about background? Family, I mean. Surely you can't just drop down on people from nowhere and expect them to receive you with open arms, can you? Almost, Claire asserted. You'd be surprised, Renee, how much easier that is with white people than with us. Maybe because there are so many more of them, or maybe because they are secure and so don't have to bother. I've never quite decided. Irene was inclined to be incredulous. You mean that you didn't have to explain where you came from? It seems impossible. Claire cast a glance of repressed amusement across the table at her. As a matter of fact, I didn't, though I suppose under any other circumstances, I might have had to provide some plausible tale to account for myself. I've a good imagination, so I'm sure I could have done it quite creditably and credibly, but it wasn't necessary. There were my aunts, you see, respectable and authentic enough for anything or anybody. I see. They were passing, too. Number, they weren't. They were white. Oh! And in the next instant it came back to Irene that she had heard this mentioned before, by her father, or more likely, her mother. They were Bob Kendry's aunts. He had been a son of their brothers, on the left hand, a wild oat. They were nice old ladies, Claire explained, very religious and as poor as church mice. That adored brother of theirs, my grandfather, got through every penny they had after he'd finished his own little bit. Claire paused in her narrative to light another cigarette. Her smile, her expression, Irene noticed, was faintly resentful. Being good Christians, she continued, when Dad came to his tipsy end, they did their duty and gave me a home of sorts. I was, it was true, expected to earn my keep by doing all the housework and most of the washing. But do you realize, Renee, that if it hadn't been for them, I shouldn't have had a home in the world? Irene's nod and little murmur were comprehensive, understanding. Claire made a small mischievous grimace and proceeded. Besides, to their notion, hard labor was good for me. I had Negro blood, and they belonged to the generation that had written and read long articles headed, "Will the Blacks Work?" Too, they weren't quite sure that the good God hadn't intended the sons and daughters of Ham to sweat, because he had poked fun at old man Noah once when he had taken a drop too much. I remember the aunts telling me that old drunkard had cursed Ham and his sons for all time. Irene laughed, but Claire remained quite serious. It was more than a joke, I assure you, Renee. It was a hard life for a girl of 16. Still, I had a roof over my head, and food, and clothes, such as they were, and there were the scriptures, and talks on morals and thrift and industry and the loving kindness of the good Lord. Have you ever stopped to think, Claire, Irene demanded, how much unhappiness and downright cruelty are laid to the loving kindness of the Lord, and always by his most ardent followers, it seems? Have I? Claire exclaimed. They, made me what I am today. For of course, I was determined to get away, to be a person and not a charity or a problem, or even a daughter of the indiscreet Ham. Then, too, I wanted things. I knew I wasn't bad looking, and that I could pass. You can't know, Renee, how, when I used to go over to the South Side, I used almost to hate all of you. You had all the things I wanted and never had had. It made me all the more determined to get them and others. Can you understand what I felt? She looked up with a pointed and appealing effect, and evidently finding the sympathetic expression on Irene's face sufficient answer, went on. The aunts were queer. For all their Bibles, and praying, and ranting about honesty, they didn't want anyone to know that their darling brother had seduced ruined. They called it a Negro girl. They could excuse the ruin, but they couldn't forgive the tar brush. They forbade me to mention Negroes to the neighbors, or even to mention the South Side. You may be sure that I didn't. I'll bet they were good and sorry afterwards. She laughed, and the ringing bells in her laugh had a hard metallic sound. When the chance to get away came, that omission was of great value to me. When Jack, a schoolboy acquaintance of some people in the neighborhood, turned up from South America with untold gold, there was no one to tell him that I was colored, and many to tell him about the severity and the religiousness of Aunt Grace and Aunt Edna. You can guess the rest. After he came, I stopped slipping off to the South Side and slipped off to meet him instead. I couldn't manage both. In the end, I had no great difficulty in convincing him that it was useless to talk marriage to the aunts. So on the day that I was 18, we went off and were married. So that's that. Nothing could have been easier. Yes, I do see that for you it was easy enough. By the way, I wonder why they didn't tell Father that you were married. He went over to find out about you when you stopped coming over to see us. I'm sure they didn't tell him, not that you were married. Claire Kendry's eyes were bright with tears that didn't fall. Oh, how lovely! To have cared enough about me to do that. The dear, sweet man. Well, they couldn't tell him because they didn't know it. I took care of that, for I couldn't be sure that those consciences of theirs wouldn't begin to work on them afterwards and make them let the cat out of the bag. The old things probably thought I was living in sin, wherever I was, and it would be about what they expected. An amused smile lit the lovely face for the smallest fraction of a second. After a little silence, she said soberly, "But I'm sorry if they told your father so." That was something I hadn't counted on. I'm not sure that they did, Irene told her. He didn't say so anyway. He wouldn't, Renee dear. Not your father. Thanks. I'm sure he wouldn't. But you've never answered my question. Tell me honestly, haven't you ever thought of passing? Irene answered promptly, No. Why should I? And so disdainful was her voice and manner that Claire's face flushed and her eyes glinted. Irene hastened to add, You see, Claire, I've everything I want. Except, perhaps, a little more money. At that Claire laughed. Her spark of anger vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Of course, she declared. That's what everybody wants. Just a little more money. Even the people who have it. And I must say I don't blame them. Money's awfully nice to have. In fact, all things considered, I think, Renee, that it's even worth the price. Irene could only shrug her shoulders. Her reason partly agreed. Her instinct wholly rebelled, and she could not say why. And though conscious that if she didn't hurry away she was going to be late to dinner, she still lingered. It was as if the woman sitting on the other side of the table, a girl that she had known, who had done this rather dangerous and, to Irene Redfield, abhorrent thing successfully and had announced herself well satisfied, had for her a fascination, strange and compelling. Claire Kendry was still leaning back in the tall chair, her sloping shoulders against the carved top. She sat with an air of indifferent assurance, as if arranged for, desired. About her clung that dim suggestion of polite insolence with which a few women are born, and which some acquire with the coming of riches or importance. Claire, it gave Irene a little prick of satisfaction to recall, hadn't got that by passing herself off as white. She herself had always had it, just as she'd always had that pale gold hair, which, unsheared still, was drawn loosely back from a broad brow, partly hidden by the small, close hat. Her lips, painted a brilliant geranium red, were sweet and sensitive and a little obstinate, a tempting mouth. The face across the forehead and cheeks was a trifle too wide, but the ivory skin had a peculiar soft luster, and the eyes were magnificent, dark, sometimes absolutely black, always luminous and set in long black lashes, arresting eyes, slow and mesmeric, and with, for all their warmth, something withdrawn and secret about them. Ah, surely, they were Negro eyes, mysterious and concealing, and set in that ivory face under that bright hair, there was about them something exotic. Yes, Claire Kendry's loveliness was absolute, beyond challenge, thanks to those eyes which her grandmother and later her mother and father had given her. Into those eyes there came a smile, and over Irene the sense of being petted and caressed. She smiled back. Maybe, Claire suggested, you can come Monday if you're back. Or, if you're not, then Tuesday. With a small, regretful sigh, Irene informed Claire that she was afraid she wouldn't be back by Monday, and that she was sure she had dozens of things for Tuesday, and that she was leaving Wednesday. It might be, however, that she could get out of something Tuesday. Oh, do try. Do put somebody else off. The others can see you any time, why, I may never see you again. Think of that, Renee. You'll have to come. You'll simply have to. I'll never forgive you if you don't. At that moment, it seemed a dreadful thing to think of never seeing Claire Kendry again. Standing there under the appeal, the caress of her eyes, Irene had the desire, the hope, that this parting wouldn't be the last. I'll try, Claire, she promised gently. I'll call you. Or will you call me? I think perhaps I'd better call you. Your father's in the book, I know, and the address is the same, 6418. Some memory, what? Now remember, I'm going to expect you. You've got to be able to come. Again, that peculiar mellowing smile. I'll do my best, Claire. Irene gathered up her gloves and bag. They stood up. She put out her hand. Claire took and held it. It has been nice seeing you again, Claire. How pleased and glad Father'll be to hear about you. Until Tuesday, then, Claire Kendry replied. I'll spend every minute of the time from now on looking forward to seeing you again. Goodbye, Renee, dear. My love to your father, and this kiss for him. The sun had gone from overhead, but the streets were still like fiery furnaces. The languid breeze was still hot, and the scurrying people looked even more wilted than before Irene had fled from their contact. Crossing the avenue in the heat, far from the coolness of the Drayton's roof, away from the seduction of Claire Kendry's smile, she was aware of a sense of irritation with herself, because she had been pleased and a little flattered at the other's obvious gladness at their meeting. With her perspiring progress homeward, this irritation grew, and she began to wonder just what had possessed her to make her promise to find time, in the crowded days that remained of her visit, to spend another afternoon with the woman whose life had so definitely and deliberately diverged from hers, and whom, as had been pointed out, she might never see again. Why in the world had she made such a promise? As she went up the steps to her father's house, thinking with what interest and amazement he would listen to her story of the afternoon's encounter, it came to her that Claire had omitted to mention her marriage name. She had referred to her husband as Jack. That was all. Had that, Irene asked herself, been intentional? Claire had only to pick up the telephone to communicate with her, or to drop her a card, or to jump into a taxi. But she couldn't reach Claire in any way, nor could anyone else to whom she might speak of their meeting. As if I should! Her key turned in the lock. She went in. Her father, it seemed, hadn't come in yet. Irene decided that she wouldn't, after all, say anything to him about Claire Kendry. She had, she told herself, no inclination to speak of a person who held so low an opinion of her loyalty or her discretion. And certainly she had no desire or intention of making the slightest effort about Tuesday, nor any other day for that matter. She was through with Claire Kendry. This concludes the first part of 6 total of Passing by Nella Larsen, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.